smokes. So, I'm often kind of the day-to-day person.
Okay, I got you now, sir. So you know what, you work for the city. You don't work for the city, you work for your own private company. Okay. So how do you do that? How do you get this job? Well, I just work in California. California. Right. I mean, it's just nothing, it's just burn. This is Bill Green, man. You also could move out the whole group. Yeah, you could.
Okay, we do. That's all right. I need to turn it. Okay. We're going to go ahead and get started here, as we kind of on a tight schedule all day. But I just want to give a real brief overview of why we're here. There may still be some people coming in, but as some of you may remember, a couple of years ago when we went through the comprehensive land use plan update, one of the things that was mentioned and that received a lot of discussion was architectural design, and we also had back in November a little workshop session to kind of introduce that topic to some of you. Were there, I think, and as to whether we're interested in looking at architectural design guidelines, and I think there's definitely an interest expressed in that. So the town has contracted through Winter and Associates to look into coming up with architectural design guidelines for the town, and we have with us today in this group Abe Barge and Chase Mullen. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to them, and they can get started with getting your feedback on this process.
I'll use the microphone even though I'm loud because I think they're recording. But thanks, Mark. So at this meeting, we will try to jump right down to business pretty quickly because we have Chase Mullen, who's actually with a firm that we work with a lot. I'm with Winter and Company, and Chase works with MIG, which is also a planning firm, and they were the ones that were the consultants for the comprehensive plan in Farragut, and they'll have a role in helping us develop the architectural design guidelines as well. And if you go on to the next slide, Chase, we will have a public workshop tonight that's just an open invitation, and I just chose a few slides from the longer presentation that we'll give tonight to introduce the public. But I just wanted to let you know, in terms of the schedule for this project, this is literally the second meeting of the project. We had the first one a little earlier today, so we're just getting started. This is the very beginning. The field is wide open. Your ideas are really important right now. In the next step, we will produce a recommended strategy, and that issues and recommendations report on there. Ignore that. That's wrong. By mid-December, we'll be done with the whole project. And so based on what we hear today and tonight, we're going to write up a report for late June. And then we're actually going to start to outline what the design guidelines will include and how they'll be organized and how they'll look. And we'll review that with the community in early July. And then we'll move on to a series of drafts of the actual design guidelines documents. And the idea is that they would be ready for consideration by elected officials in November. So if you go on to the next slide, Chase, let me back up a little bit. And most of you probably have some idea of what I'm talking about when I say design guidelines. But they can be a lot of different things, and they're used in a variety of ways around the country. Generally speaking, they're recommendations that guide the community towards a desired level of quality when property develops or redevelops through the design of the development. Design guidelines typically allow for a pretty high level of flexibility in terms of how high quality design is achieved or the design objectives are achieved. And they also can address a pretty high level of detail if that's what's desired, or can be very specific to certain kinds of context. So if you go to the next slide, Chase, I think sometimes it's helpful to explain how design guidelines typically relate to zoning standards or requirements. And so typically zoning, which of course Farragut has zoning standards in place that apply throughout the town, addresses key considerations for development or redevelopment on any property. And that would include like what uses are permitted, is it retail or residential, some basic standards for how much landscaping is required and where, how much parking is required, potentially where it can be located, setbacks, that is like the relationship of buildings to the street, how far away are they, how close. Those sorts of things are typically in zoning requirements, and as is the case in Farragut. And they're also would generally be very quantitative. That is, there's a height limit of 35 feet. That is the limit. It requires no interpretation to decide whether you've met that standard or not. Guidelines, by contrast, can be and typically are more qualitative. That is, they express an intent. So it might be that buildings new development located in a certain context where the existing scale is fairly low, fit in with that scale and provide a more low scale pedestrian environment, and then go on to illustrate and talk about strategies that could be used to meet the intent of that design guideline. But there's still some discretion that's required. That is, somebody has to be thinking about the intent of the design guideline and the specific solution that's proposed when a new development happens, and decide whether the intent has been met, unlike zoning, which is a much more cut and dried situation. So on the next slide, Chase, I just listed some of the objectives that we know are true, even at this early stage of the project, and we'll develop this further as we move along. But this project would seek to enhance community image and appearance, to implement the objectives of the comprehensive plan, of course, protect the community's economic base. So one thing design guidelines can do are really set the expectations for design so that when somebody does do a high quality design in the community, their investment is protected because they have some assurance about the level of quality that will occur on nearby sites, and to promote consistent high quality design throughout Farragut. And I should probably say that the design guidelines won't apply to single family residential development, but they would definitely apply to commercial or mixed use development, and probably to multifamily residential development as well. So just some things that design guidelines should have. They should be really clear, they should be logically organized, they should provide illustrations, they should be provide a range of strategies so that they can be flexible. That's one of the benefits of design guidelines, is the flexibility. The zoning is very predictable. The design guidelines can be flexible. And they should have an educational role too. That is, the reader should be able to understand what the expectations are in Farragut. And they can also help interpret what the whole system is in Farragut too for people. And I'll just run through just some of the design components that design guidelines could address. That doesn't mean that these would be the elements that we'll address in Farragut, but this is a good preparation for what you'll be doing with Chase in just a minute, which is that he's really good with computer modeling, and so he's kind of set up some three-dimensional models of hypothetical developments, and as a kind of point of departure for discussion of what makes those developments work to you or not. And we'll challenge him to kind of think on the fly if you think they don't work, because he can change them, just so that we can get a better understanding from you of what the really key things that the design guidelines need to address are. And also, ultimately, the kinds of illustrations that he's showing, they're not right yet, they're not specific to Farragut, but they're kind of the beginning point of the kinds of graphics that we'd actually like to include in the design guidelines to illustrate where Farragut would like to go. So some of the things the guidelines might address: the character of the street, the character of connections to neighboring properties, special guidance for unique contexts. Then on the next slide, in terms of site design, where the buildings are placed on the site, whether it's back behind a parking lot, on the corner with parking to the side, or up against the street. Parking design, signs. They can also address the character of stormwater treatment facilities. And one of the things we've done in a lot of communities lately is provide guidance about integrating stormwater facilities on a site, detention basins or infiltration areas for water that's collected into amenities on the site rather than kind of throwaway spaces. And on the next slide, there's some considerations of building design, how the height of buildings is treated. The overall height limit remains in the zoning, but that doesn't mean the design guidelines can't provide some guidance about where the tallest portions of a building would be most appropriate. And they can address building materials and color schemes, as well as sustainable design features. And let's skip this one and come back, because that one opens a can of worms a little bit. Ultimately, the design guidelines come together to produce a desired outcome in a new development. And so we want to be thinking about, is this design that you see here consistent with the vision for Farragut, and why, kind of question. Not this design specifically, but as we move forward with what we're looking at with Chase. And on the next slide, there's just another example of, as we develop these sort of computer images, we want to get to a place where you can sort of say, like, yes, that's an appropriate kind of thing for this particular context in Farragut, so that we can back up from there and figure out what steps to take to get there when properties redevelop. And this is pretty washed out looking, so you probably can't see it, but one thing I think that's going to be important here is just recognizing that there aren't necessarily a lot of sites left in Farragut that are just vacant for new development. There are some particular areas, but the design guidelines would also address what happens when a property redevelops, say an aging strip commercial center. And when that happens, there are some considerations of phasing potentially. You know, you might get somebody that comes in and just tears the whole thing down and starts fresh. That's almost like a vacant lot. But it might be that if you go on to the next slide, hopefully you'll be able to see it a little better. Yeah, so here's an example of a strip commercial center, not in Farragut. And on the next slide, this is an example of, you know, phased improvements might start to happen on that site, where the commercial center, you know, at least in this image, looks like it's sort of sitting there, may still be aging, may still have some vacancy, but some new buildings have started to be added to the site that are up closer to the street and start to bring a little bit more vitality back. This sort of final vision for that particular site is going a little far. Maybe there's only one or two places in Farragut where this could happen or even would be appropriate. But just to sort of show how, you know, we want to be thinking about smaller scale and incremental improvements that are gradually moving you towards a desired long-term vision. And that's it for me for the introduction. Do you have any questions about the project in general before I turn it over to Chase? No questions. I've left you speechless. All right. So these models that Chase will show you, they're sort of generic in the sense that they're not on a real site in Farragut. They're just ideas for different kinds of development to get the conversation started. And so this first one, this is like a commercial building of a kind of modest scale with parking between the building and the street.
So I think the idea for this exercise is to talk about the elements that are important to the community. What are the components that we want to identify in these design guidelines that want to be the shared commonality amongst development, and perhaps at maybe various degrees, but nonetheless, what are the things that you think are important in creating the Farragut community character? So this is meant to be a discussion. This is so just to give you an overview here, I you know, these are not any place. These are not even intended to be the current direction about thinking for what we're trying to do. These are just things for you to react to and start pushing in a direction. So I created kind of this large format commercial prototype, some smaller format ones. This one's, you know, clearly set back behind parking. This one is a little more inside out. Office, a few different types of office building, some of which I you know are perhaps inappropriate for Farragut. Other ones, you know, we could find, you know, looking quickly outside, and then multifamily. So is there any so in addition to, you know, the kind of site design aspects, we can dive into specific architectural ones. We can talk about materials and how we'd like buildings to be organized, maybe generally, or wherever you want to go with this.
So yeah, let's start with that one, and maybe just to get the ball rolling. So this has been proposed in Farragut, maybe on the Kingston Pike somewhere. Might be a redevelopment, probably would be if it were on the Kingston Pike. And what's the issue with the? Right. It doesn't meet current landscaping requirements, as you can see it there. Right. There is there are some landscaping requirements now. Yeah, well, some of those things
Yeah.
are in the zoning standards now that would actually require this to have more landscaping than what you see.
So we can maybe get rid of some of these and.
So Chase will start to add some landscaping. What about that building design, just in general? Not impressive. How so?
It just looks flat and boring, and it wouldn't catch my eye at all from the road. If you could see it from the road, I'm not sure you could the way it's sitting right now.
And so being able to see it from the road, that's just because it's behind the parking lot?
I think with Farragut, it's important to be able to see at least signs designating what it is from the road.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think.
You've probably more or less seen this same building in a lot of places in Farragut and a lot of places everywhere else. Do you think that, it does have a little bit of design to it. It's not just a box. Does that help?
If you saw the slide, it's like, cars, and
Mhm.
all the accessories or whatever you call it, complement it. I can't really say that, I mean, it has different shapes and sizes, on them, which would be interesting, but it seems that the way that it's
You might have to assume the worst, yeah. So, and Chase, before you look at the materials, maybe let's just think about the accents on the building that would be more fundamental. Like you were sort of saying, it looks flat. What would help? Do you think? Like more substantial canopies or something? Yeah.
How about,
Yeah, you've got some canopies over the.
yeah, maybe,
Those-
maybe some
and
more
that's like a
elements like
pergola.
this, or were you thinking more specifically about maybe taking something like this and that we multiply this effect a little bit?
Maybe more substantial, if you could.
This is gonna be fun.
Mm-hmm.
It looks great and contemporary now, and then 10 years down the road, like, this is awful.
Yeah.
It's like the roof line over here, and the road is kind of like, pulling out. I think,
Yeah.
fix that. If you're gonna do awnings, is it easily updated?
Well, awning's more easily than most other things, probably. But.
I didn't see this is kind of where the first watch, the course landscapes and stuff. They have some benches and some planters and some things out front that add interest. It's not necessarily on the building, but more so in front of the building.
Oh, good, we're getting a planter. Yeah.
I could grab some benches and stuff, but I think,
There's a green space required around the building. Adjacent to the building.
yeah, like,
Grass.
grass.
Does it literally have to be grass? Or it can be like trees that are kind of up against the facade of the building, right?
It's grass, isn't it, Mark? It has to be adjacent to the building.
Yeah. So it could potentially, on the fly, Chase probably won't be able to put them where they would logically have to go, then not block doors and windows, but they could be sort of planter boxes like that with trees and shrubs in them, right? I mean,
Let's do something like.
mhm.
So what are you putting the link in? What is that you put in the
This?
plan?
Yeah, this would be some kind of planter, something a raised planter of some type. Oops, not the whole thing.
Aging population, the ditches are very
Mhm.
practical.
You're gonna look for benches?
Yeah, we can. We can go any direction we want. Oh, shoot.
So,
We'll come back
you know, back to that, the building looks flat thing, when he has the building back up on the screen.
What kind of bench you guys like?
Oh, there's a wide variety of choices. That one looks all right. Do you think it would help if there was more change in the roof line or variation in height somehow? Yeah. Right, as long as you can't tell. But yeah. You think that's enough, or would you want to push some, like do a little tower element at the
Yeah,
corner or
so,
something like
yeah,
that?
maybe, let's see.
Are those screens on the roof?
Yeah, some type of, yeah, HVAC or it behind something screen. It was just something generic, not to,
No parapet.
well, in this, there is, but.
Yeah, I don't know if the parapet might have to be taller in order to actually hide those.
Can't see it right
We can
Okay.
can actually go out to the road and
Yeah.
just
so
check
we-
the view. Yeah, it looks like it actually does hide it. Yeah, that's good.
So something maybe like a corner element, something that actually.
That's what I was thinking.
that
I don't know
kind
if
of
anyone else.
more wraps.
Yeah. Just some kind of variation in the mass of the building that looked a little bit more fundamental.
Slide you over here a little bit. Sorry, what was that? Oops, undo those. It's kind of, it's really funny doing this kind of thing. It makes me think of Bob Ross. Like, let's put a little happy parapet in here.
Thanks.
Now, you can put window on both sides.
Sorry.
Yeah. So you think that helps?
Maybe we need to actually give it some actual some ground floor expression. Let's get this guy out of the way.
How expensive is the sort of thing for a business or a take off of?
Good question. That's something we need to be thinking about. And what we heard in the first meeting we had earlier today was that it was going to be really important to be cognizant of of the threshold wherever it is, and it probably is in a different place on different properties in different parts of town, where trying to say that they need to do something like this or anything else that we talk about today actually just makes it too difficult for them to do the development, and that's certainly not the intent of this. The intent is actually to promote positive redevelopment that enhances the community character. So in terms of the specific question about this tower element, I don't know, but that's why I think, especially as the concepts come together, we need to be talking with architects and developers in the community so that
To
we're sure that we
balance.
understand.
And maybe this actually becomes, some type of, gateway into the space.
Yeah, maybe the most important retailer has its main entrance there in the center.
Sorry, we'll just move you.
I think that I would love to see if there you have some sort of design that encourages people to walk
Mhm.
around the stores.
Mhm.
I haven't even found myself driving to the sign and it's not a very long walk, so I don't know how you do that, sort of like that, but I don't think that's a condition.
Yeah. So in that example that you're talking about, you technically could walk, right? There is an actual sidewalk that runs along the stores.
It's all, yeah, look at it, it's all concrete.
You just don't feel like it. It feels like walking through a prison or.
You know, a lot of the, it reminds me of the pavilion at Turkey Creek.
Uh-huh.
I love to walk. It makes me want to walk through that park. It's like a mountain and it's like sand and it's like easy. I'm sure that's very expensive, but that encourages you to move.
Yeah. So other than the music, what do you think?
The fountain.
The fountain. So that's just, you know, makes a nice sound probably, and it's kind of a focal point.
Right.
Yeah.
And it makes next to everything.
Mm-hmm. So multiple ways of connecting between places would help too.
And they built it so that you have those walkways through the parking lot that are independent of the designated spaces for pedestrians. So hopefully
Right. Good. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of landscaping, where's the most desperate need, do you say?
Yeah, I actually didn't
He
put any
just-
curb cuts in here. we can think we
Yeah,
can
you can't
assume
even
they're
get in the
happening
parking lot, so
somewhere.
that's an issue, I guess. Yeah, you just drew that path from the sidewalk to this, to
Yeah.
the street, right? And then that would have a landscape strip along it, probably.
Yeah, so.
And it might also have a special paver, I would assume, to both for decorative purposes and also to let you know this is where you walk, as opposed to a vehicle area.
Couldn't you build pedestrian walkways in the parking lot so that, you know, you have that area like Turkey Creek where hopefully nobody looks over you because they know it's a walking area that they can cross to. Does that help with walking and with the look of the parking lot?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure it would. Okay. No. Okay, I think we're going to start. We okay, Ashley? Okay, great. So, thanks everyone. We have a pretty light crowd, so this will be intimate. Feel free to move closer, ask questions. I am Abe Barge. I'm with Winter and Company. We are consultants that are helping the town of Farragut with this project to develop a set of architectural design guidelines for the community. And I'll explain what that means a little bit more as part of the presentation. With me is Nori Winter, sitting there, and Chase Mullen in the back is actually with another firm, MIG, and they're the consultants that helped the town with the comprehensive plan. Suddenly we're on like FaceTime or something somehow. Ah. We definitely don't want to be looking at that. Oh, much better. And also we have Ashley Miller with the city here, and Mark's here somewhere too, isn't he? Mark Shipley? And so they're available for questions as well. So the agenda that we have planned for tonight is we'll give a presentation, hopefully keep it to about 25 minutes long. We have planned a workshop activity. We'll kind of decide maybe a few more people will wander in, but if this is all the folks we've got, it's possible that we'll just move to this back table to do the activity, and I'll explain what that is a little bit later on in the presentation. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion to recap the activity and talk about next steps. And does anyone need an agenda? Raise your hand. There are some by the front door, and Ashley can give you one if you need one. There's actually a comment sheet on the back of the agenda, so if you have anything you'd like to tell us, you can use that, and probably Ashley's the best person to give those to, or you can hand them to me. So the topics for the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about what design guidelines are. You may not be familiar with the concept. How they might be applied in Farragut and what sorts of things they might address. A little bit about how they might be organized, what they might look like. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific contents that the design guidelines might include. So design guidelines are a set of recommendations that are intended to guide development in the community towards a desired level of quality through the design of the physical environment. So basically they are a set of recommendations, or they can be regulations as well, depending on how they're applied, that shape development and redevelopment in the community. So we'd be talking about what happens when a vacant parcel at the edge of town, and there's a few places like that left. What happens when there's a development proposal on a parcel like that, and how does the community help shape the design of that to be consistent with community objectives, many of which are articulated in the adopted comprehensive plan. And also what happens when redevelopment occurs. So existing strip commercial center like the previous Kroger site, for instance, what if there's a development proposal there? The design guidelines would also address that. They will probably just be applied in commercial areas of the city, or to commercial and mixed use development, as well as to any multifamily development that occurs. And let me just tell you a little bit about the distinction between zoning, which most of you probably are familiar with, the basic rules for development, and what they address and what design guidelines address. Zoning, typically they are quantitative rules, like a height limit of 35 feet, say, and the zoning is prescriptive. So that is, it's a hard and fast rule. It doesn't really require much interpretation generally. Either you're under 35 feet or not. Design guidelines, which typically overlay zoning, can address a higher level of detail, but are more qualitative typically. So some discretion is required to determine whether you've met the intent of a specific guideline. So it's not going to be a height limit. It's would be more something like, is the height appropriate in that particular location? Is the height in the development in the right place? That is, if the development is adjacent to a residential area, for example, you might prefer the height to be pushed towards the site that's away from the residential area. And so the interaction of zoning and design guidelines, the zoning is very predictable. So you kind of know what you're going to get. However, it doesn't necessarily offer much flexibility. The design guidelines may be a little bit less predictability, although we'll try to write very tight design guidelines that produce more predictable outcomes, but would typically allow for more flexibility than zoning rules. So this, I should mention, is the kickoff of the project today, and we've had meetings throughout the day with various stakeholders and officials. But we're right at the beginning. So the field is wide open right now. There's a lot of questions we need to answer as we move forward with the project. We do know that some of the basic objectives of the project are to enhance community image and appearance, to implement the objectives of the comprehensive plan, to protect the community's economic base. So you can see how design guidelines might protect the investment of somebody that's done a relatively high quality design by ensuring at least a certain level of quality on adjacent sites, to promote consistent high quality design in Farragut's mixed use commercial and multifamily districts. And the design guidelines, as we get to drafting them, some of the characteristics that they should have would be very clear statements of intent. We don't want you wondering why we're saying a certain thing. Is it to make an area more pedestrian friendly? Is it to enhance community appearance? Is it to protect nearby lower scale residential areas? We want to be clear about that. To be logically organized, we want to be very illustrative and graphic in the document, so show a lot of pictures and diagrams to explain what we're talking about. And the design guidelines really can play an educational role too. So the guidelines can help explain what sort of design Farragut is looking for, can also help explain how the zoning regulations work and provide more illustrations of things that work within the zoning regulations. So one of the big questions we'll be looking at as we move through the first half of the project or so is how the design guidelines will actually be applied, because that's a bit of an open question right now. We know that we're looking at what makes a project compatible and high quality in the Farragut context, but not necessarily how the design guidelines would be specifically applied as part of the process. Some general ideas in terms of how they're used in other communities. It could be part of the formal site plan approval process. So that's an existing process that a project goes through where the city staff determine whether it meets the zoning regulations and other regulations. The design guidelines could be part of that process. Yes, it has to meet the intent of the design guidelines as well. Or it could be more incentive-based. That is, if you are found to have met the intent of the design guidelines, you get some incentive. That could be a number of things, a reduction in required parking, or when there's uses in the zoning code right now, uses being like residential or commercial, where it says that the use could be allowed but is conditional, that is based on various conditions. Well, maybe if you met the intent of the design guidelines or certain design guidelines, that could be part of getting an approval for that use. They also could be advisory, that is, there is some review using the design guidelines, and they're used to help ensure that you've met the zoning standards, but they're less a formal part of the approval process in that particular case. So, in terms of topics that the design guidelines could address, I'll run through it at some various levels of design that we could be looking at. And we actually have a poster in the back of the room that has a lot of objectives and topics that could be part of the design guidelines on it. And then we have some sticker dots that you could place to say that's really high priority, this thing, low priority, or don't care. And if you put some of those dots on there, it'll help us understand, at least to you, what are the things that really rise to the top of the list in terms of things that guidelines should address. One of the general categories would be like neighborhood design types of thing, really big picture things. The character of the streets, connections to adjacent properties, special guidance for unique contexts. Another area would be site design. That could include building placement, landscaping and lighting, parking design, signs, public amenities. Stormwater could be a consideration. That would probably mean that the design guidelines would be looking at how, every project has to meet stormwater regulations, but there are different ways you could go about doing it. You could put a bunch of detention for water, in some corner of the site, or you could integrate it into the design in a way that made it into kind of an amenity. And the design guidelines can talk about different approaches for that. In terms of building design, the guidelines can address the height and massing of buildings, building forms and accents. We can talk about what some of those things mean. Building materials, as well as sustainable design features if you want to promote, for instance, some of the stormwater stuff kind of overlaps with that. Permeable paving systems or solar panels or energy generating systems could be encouraged there. And then there are other topics, and we have some space on the poster for that too. We certainly won't think of everything. In terms of organization, we'll be thinking about, what makes the most sense here. Is it that there's a section on neighborhood design and a section on site design, kind of like I just ran through, or it could be a section for a certain type of project. Or if you're doing a residential multifamily project, here are the guidelines. Or they could be by context. So the guidelines could be different for different parts of town, or kind of all of the above. There would be ways to kind of work all of that in as well. In terms of their literal format, we typically like to standardize it as much as possible to make it more user-friendly, so that every guideline has the sort of same structure. So the example on this page, it's probably not that easy for you to see, but in this example, this is a design guideline, and it says, establish a sense of human scale in the design of a building. That's a pretty general statement. The bullet points under it, though, which I can't quite read from here, and you probably can't either, express specific strategies that would meet the intent of that guideline. That doesn't mean that those are the only things that would meet the intent of the guideline. That's just to explain basically what the guideline means and what some appropriate strategies would be, or in some cases what some inappropriate strategies would be. You may have a creative approach, though, and that's where the discretion and flexibility comes into play. Then they'd always have illustrations. Oftentimes will sort of indicate whether they're good examples or bad examples, check marks and X marks, that kind of thing. As well as, we might use other symbols like symbols for guidelines that relate to community sustainability or something like that. And another thing they can include, this is kind of part of the education maybe, is that we can help explain the process and include things in there that explain where the design guidelines fit into the overall review process, whatever it turns out to be, for instance. So this is an example of that. And looking at some potential tools that we could include in the design guidelines. So one thing I mentioned before would be that planners call it connectivity. That's like encouraging connections, things to be connected to other things. And that can mean a lot of different things. It could mean in a small strip commercial area that it's actually possible to drive from one parking pod to another within the site, and then actually to drive into a neighboring parking area. And the same for pedestrians. And Farragut already has some rules about how pedestrian connections have to be made, but we could look at enhancing that. So how you would walk from property to property and how that would be set up. And they can address public amenities. Typically, this would be the kinds of small scale, usually, improvements that are made as part of a private development that kind of contribute to the public realm. So, in this example, there's just a plaza between buildings with some chairs set out in it, and one of the buildings has a restaurant in it, so it works for that. This is a similar sort of example in a computer model with a kind of amenity. It's not just a leftover space, it's a place where you can go hang out as part of the development. And we can kind of illustrate a range of options. If one of the intents of the design guidelines is to provide like high quality public spaces, for instance, we can describe and illustrate a lot of different ways of doing that. Here's an example of one. Just today, this is at the Renaissance development. This development is a little isolated right now, and maybe that's why nobody's hanging out here. But in terms of like the proportions and details of that public space, it's a pretty attractive space, and that's included as part of a private development project. Here's a building, little big in terms of probably what you'd really see here or want to see necessarily. It's at potentially in the town center area right around here if that were to redevelop. But it's illustrating one of the design principles that we might talk about, especially for a bigger building, is like breaking it down into smaller parts that are a little bit more relatable to traditional dimensions here. And in this case, there's kind of these vertical breaks that you see along the face of that building, which actually is a parking structure that's wrapped with other uses, interestingly. And similar principle here. This is a somewhat smaller scale building, but it's kind of broken down. In this case, there's less offset in the building, but there are architectural elements that are creating that kind of rhythm that make it appear like it could be a collection of more traditionally scaled building elements. And another thing to look at would be the ground floor character, or what you'd experience as a pedestrian, maybe even if you're just walking in front of a commercial building that you've just parked to go into. The city currently has some zoning regulations that relate to the landscaping against the wall of the building, and you'll see that in a lot of the newer buildings, that the trees up against there. There are other things that we can consider in the design guidelines process. This particular example here kind of relates to the city's existing zoning requirements, that there's kind of landscaping against the building wall. There's other treatments that we could encourage on blank building walls, like wall art, for instance, or this sort of more involved landscape screen treatment to help make uninteresting walls more interesting and inviting to pedestrians. This is an example of what I'd say was articulation, again, like breaking the building down into parts. In this case, it's really done with changes in materials, which is something that we actually heard about earlier today from folks when we showed them different options that kind of resonated with them. That typically, they want really high quality materials, but it might not be the best thing, for instance, for a building to be 100% brick, that it actually looks more compatible with the context when there is some variation in materials. And then, down to the materials and details. How are awnings used, for instance, and lighting and signage, and how are buildings and materials, or windows and materials arranged. And then I mentioned stormwater, and just see some illustrations here. This one is in Farragut, and so is this one here. This is under construction at the new larger 4-story building that's part of that new development down Kingston Pike. And the design guidelines can illustrate how to work stormwater management systems into the site design to make it more attractive. And oftentimes these strategies are more cost effective and result in better water quality as well. So, excuse me, bringing it all together, you'll see this image is one of the ones that we'll have in the activity that we'll do. And, you know, one of the things we really want to understand is which things, when you combine all of those elements, really resonate to you, and where it's the whole thing or some part of it says to you, like, yes, that's the kind of thing that would be appropriate, at least in some part of Farragut. And that'll really help us kind of reverse engineer the process for getting you there using the design guidelines. Here's another example you'll see in the images. Small scale village character building, in this case, incorporates some design elements. There's the pitched roof. There's a kind of small courtyard or public space as part of that project. Here's a larger format of grocery store with a kind of interesting design. You may hate it. You may love it. I don't know. This is a illustration from a design guidelines document where, you know, as part of the process, we'll take all of the ideas that we're getting and actually create computer models of development that we think exemplify some of those concepts, review them with the community to make sure we actually heard right, and then talk about how the guidelines relate to those developments. And this is an example from another community here of a multifamily residential development that meets their design guidelines. And this is in another community, a larger scale, a commercial redevelopment of a large shopping center site that meets their design guidelines. And I'll skip by that one and on to this one, just because I want to bring up the concept that while a lot of the design principles I think we're hearing about so far, we'll see tonight, have a sort of similar quality and would probably apply to the redevelopment of the Kroger site about as much as they would apply to just a vacant site at the edge of town in terms of the types of things that we're hearing about would be appropriate. But, you know, in reality, a lot of these existing sites, the way that they'll redevelop will be kind of in phases or over time. There might be really small scale improvements that are proposed. For instance, a small restaurant or convenience store might propose to renovate its facade or make an addition, and we need to be prepared to provide guidance in the design guidelines to address that situation where we probably can't expect that, you know, this new facade is going to solve every problem with that small scale building. That's just wouldn't be financially feasible for the owner of that building. But we can maybe have some expectation about it furthering the design towards the ultimate desired outcome. And let me just show you an example. This is, again, from another community. We'll start to develop some scenarios that are more specific to Farragut. I think this general scenario is potentially relevant here. This is kind of an aging strip commercial center, has a pretty high level of vacancy. One, you know, in a series of phases, this probably wouldn't happen all at once. New buildings actually could be built on the site, in this case closer to the street edge, that kind of enhance the appearance of that center, brings new vitality into it. But, you know, at least in the phase that we're seeing here, I don't know that that much has happened to the actual center. It remains in the back there. Maybe it's found some new uses, but may not have been upgraded that much. We just have new buildings that are really consistent with what they're going for in that community there, which is making the street more pedestrian friendly and presenting a kind of enhanced image on the street that isn't all about surface parking lots. And then this might scare you a little bit, this kind of final phase, but you can see how, you know, incrementally over time that site redeveloped to be consistent with this community's vision for a site like this, which is actually in their equivalent of this kind of town center area, would actually redevelop to be a much kind of higher intensity, more active, interesting place. But that might take a while. And in this case, you know, we've sort of illustrated that actually some of the original shopping center buildings are incorporated into that development. So the overall schedule for this project, in late June, late this month, we'll post a general recommended strategy document, and what that'll include is a recap of everything we've been hearing so far, including what we hear tonight, as well as the preliminary suggestions or recommendations for how to move forward with those ideas. So all those tools that I talked about, that, wall articulation, the design of public spaces, which ones of those tools really are appropriate to address what we're hearing here, and how. That's what that report will include. And ignore the issues and recommendations report on the second line. That's just a typo. The design guidelines outline and format template will be next in July. That document will take it to the next step, where we'll actually outline what we think the content of the design guidelines should be and how they'd be organized. And then the city will post that on the website, and so you're welcome to comment on that. And we'll move forward with those comments to develop the first draft of the design guidelines, which we aim to have complete at the end of August. And then based on feedback on that draft, we'll produce another in mid-October. We'll have additional really formal opportunities for public input, public open houses and workshops in late October. And then the plan is to have a final draft of the design guidelines ready in towards the end of November. So this activity that we have planned, and Ashley, what do you think about getting people around? Should we try that table, or do you want to move to the other room? Okay. How social are you guys? Well, I'll tell you about the activity, and we have in another room some more space set up for it, but we probably don't really need that much space. So what we're planning on doing is we have some maps, kind of poster size, and they're maps from the Farragut Comprehensive Plan indicating what the plan sees as desired future land uses for different parts of town. So it basically says, this area is commercial. It designates the area around where we are right now actually as being like more of a vital town center sort of area, and has a kind of objective for various other areas of town. And then we have photo sheets. So they're photos that we've taken from around the country. We're not trying to say they're good photos. Some of them, you might like, some of them you might hate. And they show just a variety of different design treatments and different scenarios, basically. And what we'd like you to do is, take out the photos, take a look at them, see if any really jump out at you as being things, illustrating things that you really like, or maybe that you really hate. And you can cut them out. We have scissors, actually, and glue sticks. And there's a place to write a caption. And the caption is really important, because if you stick it on the map and don't put a caption on it, we won't know for sure whether you liked it or didn't like it, or if you liked it, what you liked about it. Because it may be that the photo shows something you like, but overall you don't like the whole thing. And so just caption it like that, and you can use arrows to point to things. And so that's the activity. And I think we'll at least initially try to gather around this table. And if it seems too crowded, we can move some folks that are feeling claustrophobic, we can move over to the other room. While they're setting that up, do you have any questions about the project?